Welcome to This Week in Creationism, episode 13, recorded November 17th, 2021. I'm your host, Joel Duff, and here we look at the headlines in creationism over the past week. Today we have Amber again, post-flood mammoth problem, and the 10 best evidences for a young Earth. So I say amber again because I've talked about amber before. And I've done a whole video, separate video, just on the origins of amber and the question of amber and creationism. And lo and behold, two different articles on amber come out as headlines in creationism this past week. Here we have Timothy Clary at Institutes for Creation Research. Flood explains mysterious crab in amber. And so this is a remarkable story of an incredibly well-preserved crab found in a small amber block. I know that block looks fairly large in this picture, but that crab is only a couple millimeters wide in diameter. So it's a very, very small crab, but nonetheless, under the microscope, it's preserved in incredibly fine detail, which is really the miracle of amber and amber preservation. Amber, just to remind you, is fossilized tree resin. And so it's a product that some trees make and ooze out as a protective um, material against, you can think of it as kind of like your immune system to prevent some kind of attack from insects getting into them. And they ooze this stuff out and it protects the plant. There are some notable plants that are alive today that produce voluminous amounts of resin. Most of you are familiar with resins if you think about maybe pine trees. But in the past, it seems that there was a group of trees that are extinct today that were high producers of resin to the point where very large amounts of resin would appear on the side of the tree and probably then fall down or drip down from the trees. In which case they had the opportunities to drip right on top of organisms that are walking around under the trees and collect other materials from whatever is around that on the forest floor. And so what makes this story particularly interesting and why it was newsworthy, all right, in the scientific area is because a crab, especially a crab that appears to be adapted for living in the water, all right, not a land crab, being found in amber, which is usually associated with more of a, like I said, a land forest, raises the question of like, well, how did this crab get trapped in this piece of amber from Myanmar? Um, yeah, so just let me read just a little bit from the end of that paper. The final clue. The final clue comes from the amber itself. The amber surrounding the crab contains carbonized wood fibers and insect frass, or excrement, indicative of a forest floor environment. So the water-dwelling crab had to somehow be transported to the forest floor where it became trapped in resin. Perhaps the same colossal flood that washed the marine creatures onto land also ripped apart the trees to cause them to spill so much resin and to bury the whole forest in sediment. And of course, that's that's his conclusion is that this is just more evidence of a global flood, because how could you get a crab that lives in the water stuck into some resin from a tree that would have been on land? Now, I am not going to go over, I'm not going to go through the whole story because I'm going to point you to in a moment to the video I made, which spends 25 minutes talking about just how this could have happened and more characteristics of Myanmar amber, because you need to know the background of the particular forest type, the type of trees that were there, the other geological setting, all right, and the other types of fossils that are found there, such that we know what kind of environment this was. But it appears that what we're looking at is an estuary sort of environment. You think of southern Louisiana, right, where you have some land area, land mass, but it's barely above sea level. And then you have tides, of course, that come in, and farther inland, you might not have the tides. But when you have large storms, you can have salt water brought into these various forests and then dragged back out. So here you have these trees, and imagine these are trees that are large resin producers, right? And much of the year there might be dry land underneath, but at other times you're going to have things dragged in from the water and left behind. And so it's not really shocking to find the combination of aquatic organisms and land-based organisms both trapped in the resin. You also have insects trapped in the resin when the resin is on the tree itself prior to it falling down from the tree in the forest floor. So all of that makes for a very complex environment. And as you would see, if you want to learn more, watch my other video, and I go into more detail about this particular location and why the young Earth creationist argument of just trees being ripped up and somehow resin spilling out of them, which really, honestly, that wouldn't really be the case. You'd have these voluminous amounts of resin just from fractured trees. Um, and then you'd expect more of a mixture of various kinds of sediments being stuck in this resin, and much of this resin is amazingly pure, representing resin that took time to develop on the side of a tree or on a branch, allowing for insects to be encapsulated into it without having, a bunch of mud and sand and all kinds of other things you would expect if you had a chaotic global flood that was, and this resin was just oozing out of trees or floating around in the flood. We wouldn't expect to see the kind of organisms we see and the collections of organisms we see in the clarity that we see in resin today, or in fossilized resin today. But I'm going too far because that's really all in my my other lecture. Um, this is the paper that the ICR paper is referring to. Crab and amber reveals the early colonization of non-marine environments during the Cretaceous, and what they're emphasizing is they look very closely at the detail of the crab, and which suggests, based on the morphology of the gills and all that stuff, that this crab may have lived in more of an estuary sort of environment rather than in pure salt water. And again, that fits again with the location where this amber is found and the other types of organisms that have been found in this amber. In fact, if this story sounds at all familiar, even if you haven't watched my other video on Myanmar amber, I have talked about, and that particular video is actually about this particular specimen right here. In this particular piece of amber is a bunch of stuff. There's like 15 different species of organisms, but there is a estuary or saltwater mollusk that's found in this, or ammonite that's found in this particular amber. And the question was, how did that get there? Now, this particular um, ammonite is actually wasn't living at the time, and so it's just a shell. So it could just be swept in, just like water sweeps into the forest in Louisiana and leaves stuff behind, and then a blob of amber falls on it, and voila, you've got a saltwater organism trapped in amber. It's not that hard to imagine. Um, and so all of this is a screenshot from my talk on Myanmar amber, snapshots from the Cretaceous period, I call it, because that's what amber does. Is it's an incredible tool for sort of like visualizing the past. There they are. There's organisms. There's a little mite. Everything from dinosaur feathers are found in amber, bird feathers are found in amber, tails of organisms, small, tiny little pieces of mammals are found in amber. And all of that is in a fairly concentrated location where this particular dense forest of a particular type of tree that produced this amber is found. And that has given us an incredible sort of view of this particular period in time, what types of organisms were alive there. Now, this relates, I'm spending a little time talking about this because this relates to the couple days later, I see there's this article on the front page of creation.com from Creation Ministries International. Fossils in amber defy long age dogmas. And that's a picture of a caterpillar that's preserved in amber. And so this is just a few days later after the ICR article, here comes this paper. And then I open it up, and the other title of it is Startling Fossils in Amber Defy Long-Age Dogmas. And look who it's by, our friend Philip Robinson, who's an MDiv, um, not a scientist, but has taken a special liking to amber, apparently, because he's the one that's written a couple other articles about individual. Well, he's the one that wrote the article about the amber that I talk about, and my whole um, my whole talk here is really about his article on Myanmar amber. And so he's back a couple months later to tell us that these startling fossils that are found in amber defy long-age dogmas. And the quote here is probably the money quote. Taken at face value, stasis is evidence against evolution, but creatures not changing much at all over a few thousand years fits well into biblical history. And so this is the common tactic used. I think it's very effective for a particular audience, meaning an audience that doesn't really know what evolutionary biology is or expects, but more importantly, um, it doesn't have a critical eye for taxonomy and differences between organisms and how much those differences might actually entail or mean in terms of their significance. And so it's pretty easy to show. Oh, I don't have all the pictures, but this article just goes down a series of, oh, look, here's a caterpillar that looks just like caterpillars today. And here is a feather that looks like feathers today. And here is a piece of, what was it? Oh, well, he actually has the ammonite shell. And then so there's a series of things that are seen, like ants, right, are seen in the amber. And then you can show a picture of ants today, and it's like, well, look, ants look like ants. And of course, there's thousands of species of ants that are incredibly diverse in multiple different kinds of ants. Um, and so even an ant really isn't just an ant, even to a creationist. But nonetheless, it's an effective strategy to say, look, these things look the same. Hey, they haven't changed, right? Evolution hasn't happened. Now, that's missing one of the critical things about, I think, evolutionary theory is that nothing about evolutionary theory says that an organism has to change its morphology over time. If your morphology works very well for you in a particular circumstance or a particular environment, then there's no need to change. I mean, dragonflies, yes, they still look like dragonflies 400 million years later. They don't need to change into anything else. They are very well suited for their particular environment. But the dragonflies alive today are not the same as dragonflies from the past. There's really no species from the past that is identical to one today. They're just the same kind of organism as in the past. So organisms change, but they may not change their external features. And so not changing their external features isn't evidence. It isn't evidence against evolution, as if evolution means organisms have to change from one kind of thing to another. They're required to do that. There's nothing that says they're required to change drastically over time. They potentially could. That's the inference from evolutionary biology, is that there are organisms that have changed quite a bit over time, but they're not required to change over time. And I would argue, in fact, there are organisms that are really they're very much are in stasis with respect to their morphology. They're not going to change over time because they are so well adapted for that environment, and that environment still exists over time, right? Their environment hasn't, for some organisms, the environment really hasn't changed much over time. And so if it doesn't change, it would be foolish for organisms to change themselves into something that's less fit for what they did before. And so evolutionary biology predicts that some organisms will be evolutionarily constrained to not changing. Um, but the bigger thing here is that he's saying, okay, well, the amber shows that these organisms haven't changed. Again, they don't have to have changed. And is it evidence that for a biblical flood? I suppose in some senses that the lack of obvious change would be consistent with if Noah's flood had trapped a bunch of organisms in amber 4,000 years ago. I agree. I wouldn't expect them to look very different than today's organisms. Um, which is interesting given young Earth creationism's push to suggest that species have hyperspeciated since the flood, right? That if you were to look at if hypothetically, if you had a piece of a canine that was trapped in amber um, it wouldn't look like a canine today, right? It wouldn't look like you're, a Dalmatian, trapped in amber in the past. That was some other kind of thing that's changed quite a bit. And you would look at it and go, well, that's quite different. Now, let's face it. I mean, insects are so simple anyway that it would be hard for them to demonstrate a tremendous amount of change. There are not many features for them to change, right? If they're going to, remaining insects, ants can remain ants for long periods of time, and you wouldn't expect them to look very different over time. But I digress a little bit too much on this particular topic. Let's move on to Institutes for Creation Research. Um, and they've got a variety of articles. Some just aren't worth talking about, like Pickles for Apologetics, yeah, a weird way of thinking about the characteristics of pickles and how that relates to the gospel message. The fossils still say no. Um, the post-flood providential Pleistocene. I love the alliteration there. And I'm only highlighting this article because of the highlights. So look over here at the article highlights. The Pleistocene layer, so they're referring to a particular portion of the geological column, and they're referring to just the very tippy top of the geological column, is a thin, loose layer of sedimentary rock lying on top of the geological column. Right? So they're just referring to the very top layers, really kind of like the Quaternary period, maybe of, if you want to think about the most recent layers, on top of the geological column. This layer was likely deposited after the flood during the Ice Age that immediately followed. So they're going to claim that this very small layer of rock was formed during the Ice Age only about 4,000 years ago. And I highlight that because if you've watched any other episodes of This Week in Creationism or watched my videos about the post-flood flood boundary, that is, where did, for young Earth creationists, if most of the geological column was caused by the global flood or laid down by the global flood, there must be a point at which the flood ended and there was no more sediments deposited by the actual flood. And then there was events that happened after the flood, resulting in more deposition of material on top, because of course mountains are eroding and rivers are running and so forth, right? And and I've pointed out that ICR is really pushing this idea that that boundary is very high up in the geological column, like way up near the tippy top. And so only a little bit of the, just like it says here, a thin, loose layer of sedimentary rock is lying on top of the geological column. This fits their narrative that most of the geological column is laid down by the global flood, whereas Answers in Genesis would say that there's a very thick layer of rock laying on top of the geological column that is the result of post-flood activity. So they talk about how, oh, secularists can't explain Ice Age, which I just think is really ridiculous. I know there's a lot of theories about ice ages and developments of ice ages and multiple ice ages, um, but this constant trumpeting that somehow there's no explanation for how an ice age could occur is a little out there for me. Um, and in the article, it talks about the Pleistocene, and then it talks about how, because of the ice age, of course, in their mind, a single large ice age, all the waters were drawn down on Earth, which is a prediction of secular, that I'll call it conventional geology, is that during the ice age, the ocean levels were much lower, allowing land bridges, and that allowed organisms to migrate from one continent to another at this time. And so he points, this author, Clary, oh, actually, this is Tompkins, is going to point out that this is when the mammoths, right, which were so common in Siberia, were able to move across the Bering Land Strait, move down into North America, and that's why North America had mammoths at the time. And of course, that perked up my ears because I've published a paper with my former doctoral student, now Dr. Beatman. And he and I wrote this paper called Pleistocene Preserve, right? Which is, very similar to the Providential Pleistocene. And we used the alliteration too, right? Pleistocene Preserve, a population growth problem of mammoth proportions. And this, I want to tell you the origins of this paper because it ended up being something different. This is actually an educational model for understanding population growth using mammoths as an example. So it's a classroom activity that we suggest that you can use to visualize geometric and exponential growth of populations. And so that's all that is really, this paper. But where it began was Thomas and I were sitting around the lab one day, and Thomas has a fascination with elephants, and I like elephants too. And we're talking about elephants, and we're talking about this problem of two elephants get off the ark, and then how long would it take to get the elephants we have alive today? And that's an interesting theoretical, or actually mathematical problem. And you sit there with back of the envelope calculations to figure that out. But then you start asking questions like, okay, but there were mammoths, all right, and all mammoths came, I remember young Earth creationists only have two um, elephant-like kind organisms on the ark, and those two elephants, probably very small elephants, um, then had to evolve into the 100 different species of elephants that have lived after the flood, at least in the Answers in Genesis model. I think that ICR will eventually disagree with them because they can't squeeze them into the fossil record, but that's another whole another problem. Um, so, oh yeah, so anyway, two elephants um, um, come off the ark, right? And then they propagate, and they have offspring, and they give rise to at least 100 different identifiable species of elephants, which then go out and populate all of Africa, all of Asia, all of Europe, all of North America, and even all the way down into South America, where there were several different species of elephants there as well. Then that's why it's a mammoth proportion, a mammoth problem. And we were originally gonna write a paper about a mammoth problem for young Earth creationism. Maybe we will write that paper someday. We actually have a large database of stuff, and so we started collecting data like estimates of population sizes of for different fossil species, because there are some fossil species, well, especially mammoths mammoths and mastodons. And there are some estimates based on tusks that have been found in Siberia of how many millions and millions and millions of mammoths there have been that have lived on the face of the earth. So we started to work on a calculation of how many total mammoths have ever lived, or how many elephants have ever lived. And of course, that would be over a long period of time. But then we ask the question, how many could be sustained at one time on the face of the earth? Like, how many species of elephants could you have, and how many total elephants could exist at one moment in time? And how long ago was that moment when there was, in the young Earth creation model, if there was 100 species of elephants, at least 50 species of elephants had to be existing at the same time, and there had to have been elephants alive in large herds on every single continent at some point in just the past 4,000 years. And so he said, what would be the max population size, the probable population size at that point? And so if at that point, and I can't remember our numbers, but if that point that the population size was, say, 35 million, um, and it was only 500 years after the flood, then could that happen? Could that actually physically happen? And that led to the whole idea of studying population growth and trying to understand how fast populations of elephants could replace themselves and how fast they could expand and so forth. And of course, our answer eventually was no way. I mean, it's just that's really impossible. Now, based sheerly on exponential growth, considering every possible positive parameter, like no elephant ever dies, and they all have way more offspring than you would expect, and so forth, right? Then just exponentially, it is possible to get to that number. But once you layer on all the other things that would have to happen, and that's what this module does, it actually asks students to think about the things that affect populations and might affect population growth, and it ultimately asks the question, makes students answer the question, why is exponential growth almost never happen in reality, especially for large organisms? And so um, yeah, so I think that would be, now I'm actually, as I'm talking about it, I'm like getting excited about maybe writing about this again. Now you see also there's also connection with this question and the whole thing where young Earth creationists are often hit with the question, like, how could there be 4 billion people on the face of the Earth if we started out as only, Noah and his sons, right, and wives? And how would you get to this point? And they use raw exponential growth with large families, long lives, and having dozens and dozens of children originally in order to make it happen. But if you were to get my paper here and you were to look at some of the things we make the students think about, I think you would start to realize that's not a very realistic scenario. Um, uh, People don't just, all the kids don't survive and all don't reproduce and have as many kids as they have, is the simple way of thinking of that. Anyway, Pleistocene Preserve, a population problem of mammoth proportions. I'll put a link to this paper in the spot below this video. Okay, that brings us to our last topic. It's actually I'm talking a lot because it's kind of a slow week in terms of interesting headlines. And I suspect next week with Thanksgiving might not have a whole lot either. We had the obligatory from Answers in Genesis rerun of Scientific Evidence, the 10 best examples of a young Earth. They trot this out, about every 6 months or so. And I just had to say something about it. I mean, it was there. It showed up this week, and so it gives me a chance to say something I've been wanting to say for a while. So here they are, the top 10 physical evidences for a young Earth. So here's what they're presenting on their website as if somebody asks, if you were to come to their site or somebody were to say like, hey, what's your best evidence? Like, what should I show somebody? What should I tell somebody about that would convince them, or at least have a chance of convincing them that the Earth isn't old, but it's young? So what are those 10 best physical evidences? And I say physical evidences, they don't call it that, but it's, in other words, not biblical evidences, but physical evidences from this world. And so here's their top 10. Very little sediment on the seafloor, bent rock layers, soft tissue and fossils, faint sun paradox. And if you follow young Earth creationist literature at all, these are like, yeah, I've heard that one. Helium radioactive rocks, carbon-14 in fossils, short-lived comets, very little salt in the sea, DNA in ancient bacteria. I have to admit, every time this article comes up, and there's actually a series of links if you go to this website that like take you to other articles that provide the support for these 10 particular evidences. Every time I see these, I'm just astounded that they can't come up with 10 better evidences. I mean, honestly, this is kind of embarrassing because these are not compelling at all. And 3/4 of these are just outright don't make sense. I mean, they make sense in a very superficial way. If you don't understand the science at all, you can use very simple math to then say this is possible evidence that the world is young. Many of these don't show the world is young, they simply show the world can't be old. But that's not an effective argument. I think if you're going to say this is the way the world is, you should have some arguments, you should have some evidence that points directly to what you are predicting, not simply saying this other side is wrong and by default we might be right. That's really what a lot of these evidences are. So just at the very beginning, they're not compelling in that way. Now, um, I'm not going to go through all of these, and I'm not going to talk about all of them. It's really not worth it. And besides, you can do some Google searching, and you can find plenty of articles written by. I've written about probably 4 or 5 of these in detail on my blog, and already explored these. There are multiple books written by Christians who have explored some of these topics and explained them in a lot of detail in a way that I think anybody can understand, but really get into the geological details or the biological details and explain very clearly why these are, I can't use any other word other than nonsense. It just, I'm trying to find a more polite word, and I would like to be polite, but these are nonsensical when you get down right to them. Um, and some of them are based on really old information, and they are totally outdated. And I just don't understand why they can't find two or three more to like throw in here and kick some of these off the list. Like, for example, number 10, DNA in ancient bacteria. If you go read their references for this, this is based on a paper from, I think it was PNAS or something like that, from like 20 years ago, which all ancient DNA people today would dismiss as an artifact and don't even think that that is a real result for a lot of good reasons, right? So for very good reasons. Um, and yet they're acting or they're bringing it to their audience and suggesting that, well, this is what scientists say is that there is this thing found in this there's this DNA in this ancient bacteria that can't possibly be there. Um, and so they just haven't updated their information at all. The very little salt in the sea, I, I've written a multi-series blog post on that one and the problems there. We've talked a lot about soft tissues and fossils. Bent rock layers, that's Andrew Snelling's big thing, right? He's done some work in the Grand Canyon. He's going to be presenting more evidence. And in this new movie that's coming out in the spring from Is Genesis History, it's going to really emphasize the bent rock layer thing. But if you've read his detailed articles he's already published, he doesn't really present at all any compelling evidence that bent rock lakers have to be evidence of a young Earth at all. And the very little sediment on the seafloor is easily dismissed. And here it is, number one. Like if that's your number one go-to, that's just I would feel terrible if this was the best response I could have. Because if you ask me, what are 10 best evidences that the world is old? I come up with a list of 100 things, each of which is going to be more compelling than any of these 10. Answers in Genesis would say they have responses to those things, but these are flimsy at best. All right, that's enough on that. I got to rant about the 10 physical evidences of a young Earth. And as I said, there's so many responses to these, it's not worth spending any time talking about each individual one or debunking them. That they are debunked over and over again by not only conventional geologists, but conventional geologists that are Christians and who have a heart for trying to really understand these issues and be faithful to the evidence. All right, my name's Joel Duff. Thanks for listening. You can find my debunking articles of some of those things right there on thenaturalhistorian.com. All right, that's it for this week. It might be a week and a half to 2 weeks before our next episode because of Thanksgiving. I'll talk to you then. Bye-bye.